Well, how I got rich in New York. Well, actually, I went to New York. I actually went there to live in New Jersey because my father had invented a form of coating a water main pipe from the inside so it wouldn't rust. That was pretty amazing technology. He did that with calcite, so it's a kind of a calcium. And then they didn't do it the right way. They screwed the thing up. And so I ended up spending 9 years. It was a 9-year sentence, as they say, living in New Jersey. And I worked in New Jersey for a while, didn't make much money. And I was a land surveyor in a couple places. I got some pretty crazy stories about that. Working down in Newark, in Newark, New Jersey, which is an absolute, crap hole and very, very dangerous place. So, but anyway, I started working as a temp and had no money at all, saved or anything. I'm very frugal and very good at saving. So I started out at $6 an hour. That was in probably around 86, 87. I was working for Panasonic as a temp and working for these Japanese guys putting phones into boxes. It was fascinating work. And so I did that for a while. And then I went to this law firm in New Jersey, and I was working for more like about $8 an hour. And I was putting input stuff into the database for them for wills and codicils and trusts and all that kind of stuff. And then I decided, well, I'm trying to get into New York. So I finally started going around to all these temp agencies and training. Can you type? This is around the beginning of computers when they first came out. So this is, around mid '80s, '86, '87. And I'm going to tell you something. There weren't too many people that knew how to, use computers back then. There was a program called Lotus 123, and I was a whiz at it. That was a first spreadsheet. It was the first big program. But I could use all the different programs. I was just intuitively know how to use computers. I got fired from my job where I worked in New York at Elsevier Publishing in 1985. And then I started working at all these temp agencies and all these different jobs. And I worked for Bankers Trust for a little while. I worked at West Bank. That's an Australian bank. I was there for a few months with this Egyptian guy. He was real funny. We became friends. He was much older than me. He was old enough to be my father. But he could see. He kept complaining. I didn't know anything about accounting. I said, "Look, I'm a temp." So, at any rate. I kept at it, and I finally ended up at this law firm. It was called Debevoise and Plimpton. I worked there for about 5 years, and this is where I cut my professional teeth. This is where I learned how to be a professional. This is a big M&A firm, mergers and executions, and it was one of the top law firms in New York City, and you see it out there. It's not ever going to go away, that thing. Debevoise and Plimpton, DNP, and really great people to work for. And I was just a temp. So I started out at like $18 an hour. Now, this is in the 80s. And then by the time I finished, I was making $23 an hour 5 years later. And I'd been, hopping around from different temp firms because one wanted to pay me more. Well, I would just go to that temp firm and have the same job. Well, at any rate, I just kept banking the money, and I was sitting around doing nothing. I remember once I called my father on a Sunday, and they would take me into the city like on a Sunday or on the weekend in a cab. It was called a radio car, but they were like big, sometimes limousine, but usually like Lincoln cars, big car. And it was nice. You get in the back seat, man, and they take you right, it was much nicer than a cab. So I always got cab rides home. And we call them radio cars. And we always got those, if it was after like 8 o'clock at night. And so I was always working till, 8, 9, 10, 11. Sometimes later. I mean, one time I worked, 75 hours in 1 week. And you think about that, and that's with a 2-hour commute each way. So I was working the third shift to begin with, but I ended up working with this guy, Eric Simonson, which a lot of people didn't, he was difficult to work with. Well, we got along fine. We're about the same age, and I gave him what he wanted. I gave him the stuff that, he wanted, done, and I gave it to him in a really good way. And I was just, an expert on the computer. And again, we're talking late 80s here, so I was working on WordPerfect 4.2, I think. 4.1, 4.2. I think it was 4.2. And this is like the ultimate word processor for DOS. But I just kept putting the money into the bank. I got into investing. I made a lot of money with mutual funds. And back in the 80s into the 90s, I left New York in 1993. New York is a very tough city, let me tell you something, but I really love it. I kind of see what it's become right now. This is 2022, and it looks like it was dangerous when I was there. Like if you look at Times Square back when I was in New York, that was just a very, very dangerous place. You did not want to go to Times Square, and I had to walk through it every day on my way to Port Authority bus terminal. So but then, there was all sorts of commuters with me at 5:30 at night. We got out at 5:30, and so 5:30, 6 o'clock. I mean, there's all these commuters walking through, and so you had safety in numbers. But this is a dangerous place to go hanging around at that. And if it got late and I couldn't catch a cab, well, then I took the subway across town. I took the E train, and at any rate. I saved a lot of money during those years. So I walked out of New York with $300,000, over $300,000 in my bank account. And that's from me just putting it in there and week in and week out. And not living extravagantly. I lived well, but I had really cheap rent in New Jersey. I lived in Lyndhurst. But that's how I saved my money. That's how I went about it. So that's how I saved all my money, and I walked out of New York, went in there with nothing. 9 years later, I had $300,000, and that's the money I used to buy my house and do it and start my business. And I eventually bought that property out on Krups Road, and that was in '96, I believe, and 1996. And then we ended up developing it, with Lori Thalen and Pat Falposh. It went sideways. It didn't work out well. There was a lot of shenanigans going on with that thing. So, in the end, I ended up, owning the whole thing. But so I had the money to invest and do that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's how I got, started. It was in New York. I really, again, what Debevoise and Plimpton did for me was you had to put up with a lot of egos there. So, anyway, I got through it. I knew how to. I was one of them. I just didn't have a lawyer education. I hadn't been through law school. But otherwise, they could sense I was knew what I was doing and knew what I was talking about. Anyway, those are my days in New York. And man, I walked out with a bundle of money. But I worked very, very hard for that money. Very hard.